Alrighty, good morning or good afternoon, wherever this finds you. This is Mr. Mayus. Welcome to part one podcast on ancient China. We're going to be taking a look at what happened before the Han Dynasty. We're going to be mainly looking at some of the beliefs that were existing in ancient China. Now, one of the questions that we have to start off by asking is, how do we know about ancient China? And one way that we know a lot of things is by these things there. Those are called oracle bones. And what oracle bones were, they're basically turtle shells or bones that a shaman or a spiritual person, spiritual leader, would write these little symbols on here. A lot of times they're questions or facts. What should we do with the crops? Or how should we respond to this pregnant lady or this leader? And they would put these oracle bones or shells into the fire, and wherever they would crack, you can see a lot of these cracks here, wherever they'd crack, they would, divine different answers to what's going on. Although these are certainly spiritual and a little bit kind of bizarre, perhaps, they do give us a lot of information. We'd been looking at ancient Egypt, and as you can see on this map, ancient Egypt running right up along the Nile, like we talked about. Ancient China is all the way over here in the far east, and as you can see, the Han Dynasty, which is at its largest and most glorious state, was quite large. And if you can't tell, it would have probably had a far larger population than ancient Egypt did. Take a look at the timeline down here. Ancient Egypt started about 3000 BC, and we kind of talked about maybe 2500 BC to all about 1000 BC, maybe even a little bit afterwards, when we mentioned Cleopatra and whatnot. But ancient China, there is some evidence of them existing about 2700 BC. But the part that we're mainly going to focus on is from about 1500 BC till after. And the Han Dynasty, which we're really going to take a look at, is this chunk in here, 200 BC to about 200 AD. But before we get to the Hans, we are going to take a look at the Shang and the Zhou. Now the Shang here is the orange area, and the Zhou Dynasty is in the yellow, and you can see it progressively gets bigger. And then you have the Qin Dynasty and eventually the Han Dynasty, but we'll get to that later. So ancient China looked probably fairly similar to the way it does now. You have a large mountainous region here, and you have a different country, some foreigners in the north, some mountain areas. And they were often invading. We'll talk about the Great Wall that was built up along here a little bit later on. This area here is some highlands, still livable but not excessively fertile. But where everything started off was in this green area here. This area is really green because mainly two rivers. One is the Yellow River, tracing along here. And the southern one there is the Yangtze River. So most of what we're talking about existed in between there. If you take a look at these symbols here, this is the Chinese writing for China. It literally means Middle Kingdom. And if you want to, these are pictographs. So they kind of, you can tell maybe a little bit of what they are based on how they look. So this would be some land, and right down the middle is a line, therefore middle. This symbol here, that stands for king, and this little dot there is jewel, so it's kind of like the land of a king's jewel, so it's really valuable land. It's actually called the Middle Kingdom because they thought that they were the center of the world, the center of civilized world. I've also heard that they thought of themselves as, between heaven and earth. All of those are possibly correct. That's a little bit why they're called the Middle Kingdom. If you take a look here, you can see the Shang. That's the area that they operated in, and they existed for a long time. We're going to take a look at some of the beliefs that were around during their time, and then some of the beliefs that the Zhou, there you go, that the Zhou were had going on in their time, all the way up till right about the Han Dynasty took over. The Qin looks like Qin, but it's actually Qin. Qin took over after the Zhou did, and then afterwards, as I mentioned, was the Han Dynasty. But we'll get to them. All right. So one of the things we want to look at is what beliefs existed back then that would affect the way they live. Now, we got to understand that because they lived between these two rivers, they were largely farmers, and they were subject to whatever nature brought them, whether it's good crops or floods or droughts or fires. And like most people, they wanted to try to control this in some way. And they believed in spirits that were called Shen. On a side note, if you ever played the game called League of Legends, there's a character named Shen. He's described as kind of this spirit. Little side note, it even comes into popular culture, which we'll see even more so. But they did their best to live at peace with the world around them by pleasing these spirits. And these spirits could be any number of things. There could be ancestors, or the sun, or the moon, or the stars. Most households would have an altar or an area that they could worship their ancestors. That they believed that though you weren't necessarily reincarnated into your body, like the Egyptians believed, they believed that where your body was, there your spirit was. So it was a spiritual place for them. And this has even come into, these beliefs and this trust in spirits has even come into pop culture now. Mulan deals with the ancestor worship. If you've ever seen Avatar, there's a scene where this big forest spirit is all angry because they're destroying his forest, and he comes in and raids and destroys his village. So there's this ancestor worship. There's also this belief that goes with it that is called the mandate from heaven. And this is the idea where the ruler, be it the Shang dynasty leader or the Zhou or the Qin, they had a blessing from the heavens. And so long as they did good, they were blessed by the heavens. This is actually the symbol here for king. You might recognize it partly from kingdom. And you can kind of interpret this is earth and this is heaven, and in between is the king. And he is sort of the intermediary in between heaven and earth. And so long as things were going well, everyone kind of believed that the king was doing the right thing. So they had this idea of a blessing from heaven for the leaders. If things started to go bad, as would happen in the Shang dynasty, they thought, oh, maybe he doesn't have this mandate from heaven anymore, and they sort of rebelled, and the Zhou, it looks like Zhao, but it's Zhao, took over. In the Zhao Empire, around 650 BC, maybe a bit before, there was another belief that came into practice, and that was called Taoism. You can see it written with a T or a D. It doesn't really make a difference. In Chinese, it's all the same. And it's a belief where basically the goal is to put yourself in line with nature, or to organize your way so you're naturally one with the world. It certainly had priests and leaders, but it didn't have an organized leadership like you might have with a pope type person. So it's a very kind of personal belief of putting yourself in line with nature, and it has this idea of simplicity and personal discipline, and everything was organized. Your clothing, the way you eat, even your furniture in your house, which is called feng shui. Or maybe you've even seen on some movies, a lot of times they're older people moving gracefully in a park or in a beautiful spot. It's called Tai Chi, and that's to put themselves at peace with everything. You'd probably recognize this symbol in the middle as the yin and yang, and it's the most famous symbol that represents their belief. And it's the idea of having two equal and opposite forces in the world that counteract each other. The yin is the dark side, the shadowy, the earth, the female side. In some cases, it's been described as evil. Don't know what that says about their view of females, but leave that for you to think about. The yang side is actually the lighter side, the fiery, the sun, the sky, the male side of thing, or in some instances good. You can kind of think of it as like when you drop a stone into water, and there's high waves, and there's high peaks, and there's low valleys, and they kind of equal out eventually. So there's a sense of balance in this in Taoism, and the idea is that you are to achieve this perfect balance with everything. About 150 years after this, a guy named Confucius came along, and what he taught was some fairly common sense stuff, some good stuff overall. He taught that family was the basis for society. Now, Confucianism isn't really a religion per se, but it is a belief system. There's this idea that a king should act like a father to their people, and look after the people, and the people, of course, as children, have responsibilities to the king. He also taught that people needed to be moral to each other in order for society to be at peace and to prosper. I don't know if you can see, but these things sort of go hand in hand with being at peace by treating everything well with Taoism. You should treat others how you want to be treated. Yeah, that's a pretty common tenet in the Judeo-Christian religions as well. And if you can only get what you want by acting bad, you need to give it up. So this is one of those thoughts that was existing in the ancient world. These things, as we'll see, kind of affect how everything sort of works. The goal for this podcast is just to have you kind of understand exactly what the people were thinking, what they believed, which affected the way they lived. They worshipped the spirits and their ancestors. They believed in Taoism, which is putting yourself at peace, and they also had this guy Confucius to come along and help them. Towards the end of the Zhao dynasty, they had broken up the empire into many different states. I've kind of had an overlay here so you can see. Many different states. Basically, the king gave this land to these people and that land to those people. They had to incorporate some of the Shang leaders they had to incorporate some of these people into their leadership, or else everyone would be just constant fighting. But what ended up happening is you have these different leaders in fairly independent states, and after a while they started warring with each other. For about 250 years, the last 250 years of the Zhao dynasty, there was fighting. What we'll see next time is one of these groups, the Qin, got very strong, and they started fighting, and they took over everything and reunited China. So that's about where we're going to leave off. I just wanted you to understand the beliefs that were in practice there, because they affect the view that the Han people took. They were in practice there. So I hope you enjoyed it. There's a few questions that you need to answer now. If you have any questions, I'm certainly always here to help. But yeah, part 1 done.